Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista and thanks for stopping by. Today I'm going to make two cards that look like watercolor, and one I'm going to use watercolor pencils and the other I'm going to use distress ink. I'm going to start with the distress watercolor pencils. I have set 1 and 3 as well as Simon Says Stamp Painted Christmas Wreath. I'm going to be using a stamping tool today. It makes it really easy if I want to re-stamp an image in the same place. And you don't have to have the distress watercolor pencils. Any watercolor pencils will do. I like distress because I like the palette, and also I like that it's all pigment. There's no wood in these pencils. So I'm just going to pick up my stamp with my stamping tool. And I've picked out some colors for my wreath. And before I place any pigment onto my stamp, I'm going to spray my stamp with a little bit of water. You don't have to spray your stamp first. You can paint some water onto your water pencils. You can dip them in water before you draw on your stamp. Each technique will give a little bit different of an outcome, but this is the one that I prefer. So now that I have that all colored up, I'm just going to close up my stamping tool and give it a press evenly all the way around. And opening it up, there are some little pools of water in some places, so I'm just going to give it a little dry with my heat tool. Now I have to be careful because this heat tool will move water and it will move the pigment that's in that water. So you can get around that by either using a craft tool that doesn't move as much air and water, or you can just keep your heat tool further away from your image. And I wanted to add a little bit more pigment, but also I wanted the colors to blend a little bit more. I could have also added more pigment to the stamp, but I chose just to add some more water and press it back down before giving it another dry with my heat tool. So the great thing about this technique is you can get multiple generation stamping. And I'm going to come in and just give one more stamp to a fresh piece of cardstock. There's still some pigment left on that stamp, so I'm just going to give it a spray with some water and close it over. It will be lighter than our original image, but that's okay. It'll still make a really nice background for another card for another day. Coming back to our original image, I want to prep this for embossing, but before I do, I want to make sure that it's really, really nice and dry because I don't want the pigments to smudge while I am prepping my cardstock, nor do I want the embossing powder to stick to anything that's wet. Just to show you how easy this stamp is to clean, I'm just spraying it liberally with a lot of water and giving it a scrub with a microfiber towel. Back to prepping my cardstock, I'm going to press my 'Tis the Season sentiment down where I want it before picking it up with my stamp tool. And just to make sure that there's no little static debris on my cardstock, I'm coming in with a paintbrush, and this is a dedicated embossing paintbrush. And I use a dryer sheet. You can also use a anti-static powder tool, but I find a dryer sheet works just as well. I'm inking up my stamp with some Versamark ink, closing it over and pressing it down, making sure to press even pressure all the way around my sentiment. And I didn't really feel like I got enough of the Versamark ink onto my cardstock, so I'm going to ink that up again and go ahead and give that another stamp. I'll be using the Wow Vintage Gold Lace Embossing Powder. I really like this embossing powder. I'm going to tap off the excess here, and since we've used a dryer sheet, it gives a really nice crisp image. And I'll set that with my heat tool. I want to make sure my heat tool is nice and warm, and forgive the sloppy transitions, but I'm just going to zoom in on this embossing, and you want to keep your heat tool on the embossing powder until it melts, and it's really easy to see. I'm going to start with the S in season and move to the right of the screen, and you can see as it changes, and once it's changed, it's melted, it's set, and you can move on to the next portion of your embossing. I'm just going to add this to a card base. And the only rectangles dies that I have are stitched rectangle dies, and I didn't want a stitched look for this card. So I'm just going to take my card front and adhere it to the card base with some liquid glue. I can hold it up to the light to line it up where I want. I'm aiming for the 'Tis the Season to be roughly in the middle. And once I have that lined up where I want it, I'll apply some pressure to let it set. Once it's set, I'll take it over to the trimmer and trim off the excess. Now, this is my favorite way to cut down a card front when I don't have a properly sized die. Please let me know your favorite way to cut down a card front in the comments below when you don't have a die. Moving on to the watercolor look created with Distress inks, I'm using the mini inks, starting with Evergreen Bough. I really like the mini inks. I find them really easy to use to get into small places, as well as if I have the same amount of money, I can buy more colors in the mini than I could in the regular size. And additionally, the regular size ink pads would be too large for this technique. Coming in with some candied apple, I'm going to add those onto the holly berries. coming in with some picked raspberry. Now, the little berries that aren't on the holly are too kind of delicate and hard to reach with just the ink pad, so I'm going to use a mini foam blender just to apply the ink to those berries. This technique would also work with the Distress Oxide, and I know that there are other inks that react with water in this way, but the Distress line are the only ones that I'm familiar with, but you can use any inks, any dye inks that react with water. I'm bringing in some spun sugar for the poinsettias. I'm bringing back some picked raspberry for the center of those poinsettias, but also I want to blend some picked raspberries into the petals of the poinsettia. I'll apply some mowed lawn to the rest of the greenery. I probably could have gotten away with using just the ink pad, but I wanted to keep the mowed lawn to the leaves because I'm going to bring in another color for the stem. And the final color that I'll bring in is the Twisted Citron. I'm just going to apply this to the stems of the greenery as well as just kind of mix a little bit into the leaves. And I could spray my stamp with water at this point, but I wanted my card to be a little less saturated, so I'm going to close that up and get rid of some of the excess ink on my stamp. This will make a fine wreath and a fine background for another stamp, so I'm going to set that aside for another day. I'll bring in a fresh piece of cardstock, spray my stamp with a little bit of water, and close it up. And again, there's going to be little pools of water, so I'll dry that with a heat tool. I went ahead and embossed the "'Tis the Season" sentiment onto this card front as we did before. I'm adding some opal quartz shimmer with a shimmer pen before I add my card front to a card base. And there you have our two cards, one with watercolor pencil and one with distress ink to obtain a similar look. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.